Welcome to Coffee with Catholic Workers, a podcast made by and for Catholic workers. I'm Theo.
And I'm Lydia. We've both been a part of the Catholic Worker for more than a decade, and we're excited to bring to you conversations with Catholic workers from around the world.
For today's episode, we spoke with Lincoln from Milwaukee's Casa Maria and Chrissy from the St. Louis Catholic Worker about the Catholic workers' history of refusing to pay taxes for war and the recent uptick in interest in war tax resistance.
NUTRIC, which is the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, will be having their gathering in November, which is going to be hosted by the Las Vegas Catholic Worker. You can find out more on their website, nutric.org. That's nwtrcc.org. Now, here's Lincoln and Chrissy.
Well, it's fun to have back on the show Lincoln from Casa Maria in Milwaukee and Chrissy, my very own community member here in St. Louis. We're here to talk about war tax resistance today. And so to get us going, can you all tell us about your experience with war tax resistance? How did you get involved? What does that even look like? What is war tax resistance?
Sure. I can jump in and start. This is Lincoln. And yeah, I don't remember if I knew about war tax resistance before I came to the Catholic Worker or not. I think I might have, and that Dorothy Day had mentioned it. But when I moved into the Catholic Worker in Milwaukee, Casa Maria, going into my senior year of college in 1998, and probably whether I kind of knew about it or not, there were multiple people in the community that were war tax resistors, and for the organization that Chrissy and I are both do work for, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, or NUTRIC for short, they had all of their lit on the books. There's many Catholic workers kind of have the books and they had all these little pamphlets and everything about it. So it really had everything that I needed to get started. I mean, a lot of the pamphlets and books were, old and, potentially slightly out of date, but it gave me the bearings I needed. And, the pacifism aspect of the Catholic Worker, I was drawn to it immediately. What is war tax resistance? What was this thing I was drawn to? And essentially it, as all the stuff, the people explained to me, and as I saw in all of these resources, it's, first is kind of the realization that about half of our federal income taxes are directed towards current military and past military expenses. And is during this time when I joined the Worker that there was the sanctions in Iraq, and UNICEF had recently published these numbers that they estimated hundreds of thousands of children had died because of the sanctions that we had, preventing medical supplies and computer supplies and things that would have helped them repair water filtration plants. And, all of these things were leading to child deaths there. And Madeleine Albright had just given an interview where she was asked if this was justified, and she said it was. She had no problem with it. And so I'd say all of that really kind of came together for me in a moment where I said, this coming tax season in spring of 1999, I'm going to start refusing to pay my federal income taxes.
Yeah, this is Chrissy. I got involved in a similar time. My first exposure to war tax resistance was at the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, where a lot of people were going to protest against U.S. militarism in Central America. And so a lot of tax money had been going towards militaries in the 1980s and 1990s and probably prior to that, but there was a lot of awareness about the implications of U.S. tax money going to these militaries being used upon their own people. And so that was kind of my entryway. And there were people who had tables about war tax resistance with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee there. at the School of the Americas. There were a lot of people, Veterans for Peace, Grandmothers for Peace, and it was just these people that I was exposed to that were so infectious with their joy and peace that not only getting the information, but seeing people in the way that they were living their lives and talking about pretty heavy issues, but also having a lightness in their being that I found really attractive. So I became aware of vortex resistance then, but also with the Catholic Worker I was involved with in 1998 with folks in Columbia, Missouri, and Steve Jacobs had just gotten back from Iraq. He had gone with Voices in the Wilderness and really was alive and on fire about just what he had seen there in Iraq with the sanctions. And at that time, the U.S. had re-engaged in a bombing campaign, and so it was very much front and center, and it really moved me and kind of changed my life. And that I moved into the Catholic Worker there in Columbia, Missouri, and stopped paying taxes, quit my job and stopped paying taxes that same year. But I do want to say that it was really within the context of community that this step was able to be approached or even considered. Becoming aware of the history of war tax resistance within the Catholic Worker became very clear to me through Lana Jacobs and other people who were sharing about that deep tradition within the Catholic Worker.
Do you mind saying a little bit about that tradition in the Catholic Worker? I mean, you've touched on it along the way. Lincoln found the books on the shelves, but war tax resistance has been going on pretty much as long as the Worker itself, right?
Yeah, I think actually it was maybe a couple weeks ago. As this topic, war tax resistance, is definitely in the air, I was invited to come and speak at the Madison Catholic Worker about war tax resistance, and I hadn't been there before, so it was a pleasure to drive over. And I started off by quizzing the people there by asking who are the two most famous war tax resistors in the Catholic Worker movement, and it only took the two tries, Dorothy Day and Eamon Hennessy. And I think that's, the two that most people would know, perhaps even outside the movement, even if they don't know they're war tax resistors. And for Dorothy, I mean, I think, again, for both of them, it went hand in hand with their pacifism. And for Dorothy, I don't know if she ever really owed that much because after the Worker started, most of her income would have been through things like royalties for writing books, and I don't think she probably made that much money, though I know she always made a point of saying she refused to pay taxes. How much she owed, I really don't know. But in the writings that she wrote about, it seemed like her daughter and the grandkids were trying to live out the life on the land, and things were very, very hard. And I got the sense if there was money that she was resisting, it was probably going to support their work on the farm, because they were living pretty destitute and pretty difficult conditions. For Eamon Hennessy, he's one of the few people who went to jail for refusing the draft for World War I and World War II. And so I don't know if he found out about, either he might have, I don't know how each of them kind of thought about war tax resistance or how it came to their minds, but I think a touchstone is during World War II that the federal income tax expanded to include the majority of Americans. Before World War II, it really only was a tax for the rich. You had to make quite a bit of money to owe federal income taxes. And so we can see there really is this history that the federal income tax, it really only exists for most people for war spending. Previous to that, it didn't exist for the average person. And so Eamon Hennessy's story, because he was so open about sharing it, he had been, I think, working as perhaps a social worker before the federal income tax expanded. And when that happened, he quit his job and started doing farm labor because he knew at that time farm workers didn't have automatic federal withholding from their wages. But at his previous job, he wouldn't have been able, at least at that point. Now things have changed, but where you can change your withholding, but when it had just recently expanded, either he didn't know how or it wasn't available to stop his federal income tax withholding. So he really went into farm work, which we all know is very difficult work, and he wasn't doing it as a young person anymore. He was already midlife and towards the other side and doing very hard labor, which I think showed his commitment to not wanting to pay federal income taxes.
I think for many people, like, not paying taxes is oftentimes something like people just hadn't, it's not even on their radar. And I've noticed, though, in some sort of activist circles or protest chats, that this idea is starting to gain a little bit more momentum again. What are some of the things that push people now towards not paying income tax? Why do you think we're seeing this sort of resurgence? And can you talk a little bit about maybe like what are some of the steps that people should think about hearing this of like, wow, is this something I should explore?
Yeah, I think it's really come into people's awareness a lot in the last 2+ years with this situation in Gaza, and seeing such a direct connection of U.S. taxpayer money towards Israel every year. And this has been a tradition that's been going on for 70 years or more, and not so much, but really in recent years. And so it's not just the money, it's the weapons, it's the overflow. It's also, seeing the increased militarization within our own cities. I mean, that the Pentagon gets so much of our money and resources that there's hand-me-downs from, the military into our own streets. And so I think it's unavoidable in a way that it hasn't been in the past, and people realizing that it's these weapons are being turned upon us, just for standing up for basic rights of our brothers and sisters, and trying to say, we want these basic needs, or we want to protect and make sure that our brothers and sisters stay here, different things. And so I think that awareness is so prevalent within our society, and people seeing that, but also that it feels like there's less to lose. I think, so many people within the current economic system don't have the guarantees that they had in the past in terms of having retirements or just economic security. And so there feels less to lose in some sense as well. And so I think, and it's just also a point of experimentation, or people taking this risk because they're seeing that other people are. I think you said many people not being aware of tax resistance, that awareness is growing. And so I think more people willing to engage in this form of protest and exploring it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the invasion of Gaza with mostly U.S.-funded weapons was a watershed moment for a lot of folks, especially younger activists who started searching us out. Like so many people those first 6 months, I'd have phone conversations where, they'd say, I found you because I just Googled, how do I stop paying for the war in Gaza? And our website would come up. And at that point, it was definitely, especially a lot of younger folks activists weren't that familiar with us. And I could tell there was some trepidation, like, can we trust you? Can we trust the information you're sharing about this? And now, because we've seen this, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a better word other than explosion, this growth, this exponential growth on places like Instagram, where I think, beforehand, maybe we had 600 followers, and now I think we're nearing 40,000. And now, a lot of people, as Trump came to a second term, and Doge and the ICE killings and, the cutting of funds for programs that people thought were good programs, and the war in Iran, like everything always seems to be, when we get a kind of a new additional wave, it's all those other things usually also are reasons people are looking into this, but it's always like the next latest thing is always the last straw for somebody. And now I think a lot of people are finding us because they have a friend that's sharing our information or sharing a post And so that kind of adds some legitimacy, and people are, I could tell the trepidation's less there because it seems like they might already know someone else who started doing this.
And maybe to go back to the question of steps of people taking, we've been offering introductions to war tax resistance online. So been doing those about once a month, Lincoln and I, with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, and also that there's videos up on our website, YouTube channels, hosting office hours. One step we encourage people to do is adjusting their W-4 for their earnings if they're employees, and many different steps, but encouraging people to come to those introductions to war tax resistance and find out more, and also have a guidebook. There's a lot of information, but I think to encourage people to find that community of people or find ways of getting support and taking the actions, steps towards war tax resistance.
Can you give us without going too nuts and bolts, because you just told us all the ways to really find out about it, but I don't know, for people who just have no clue, what does it mean adjusting your W-4? What are some of the how does this work? Because most people have just, I get a job and they take the taxes, and maybe at the end of the year I get some of it back, maybe not,
Yeah, so I'd say that's one of the most common phone calls that I get is people have heard that they can adjust how much is removed out of their paycheck if they're an employee, and that's, we're allowed to do that in the United States using what's called this W-4 form. It's a form created by the IRS, but it's just meant to be used between employers and employees. And we're in a unique situation because if you become an employee in, let's say, Canada or England, there are set standards on the federal level there that they don't allow you to say, no, I don't want anything taken out for federal income taxes. I'll quote unquote pay it later maybe. But, so I really don't know how this came into play in the United States. But for now, it's still an option. And most people, when they're starting a job or they first get hired, they're given this W-4 form. It just looks like, some legal tax form. I think most people just sign their name and don't really think much about it, but it can be updated at any time. For some places, depending where you work, you just need to fill out the new sheet of paper, or some places they even have an online portal and you just update your numbers there. But essentially there's a line on there called 4B deductions, and if you increase your anticipated, you're supposed to put down the deductions that you expect to put on your tax forms at the end of the year, expected deductions that would lower your taxable income. But if you put in a number that's high enough in there, you'll be telling their human resources computer oh, you're expecting so many tax deductions at the end of the year that we shouldn't take anything out. And so it's a way to empower people that when now the next tax season comes around, they'll owe the federal government money and they can make the decision, do I want to pay some or any of this?
And maybe I'll add too that one of the ways we see people engage in this work or the pull towards it is the simple living aspect. So one of our most downloaded pamphlets is about simple living. And so I think it really goes hand in hand too with the Catholic worker of that hungering for community or simplifying our lives in these times. And that's been, we see that having gone on for decades. And we've seen kind of an interest recently with Thoreau. There was a PBS documentary about him and his life. And I think, even going back that far into simple living and seeing tax resistance with his life too. But that hungering for community and simple living has really been at the heart of the pull for a lot of people towards tax resistance. And so, I think, people wanting to not be so engaged in the system in various ways.
And when you're talking about simple living, you're talking about living under an income that would trigger any need to pay federal taxes.
Yeah, I could. So for the standard deduction for it's basically whatever the standard deduction is based on your filing status. So for a single person in tax year 2026 is going to be 16,100, and for if you're married filing jointly, it's 32,200. But I think in the Catholic worker movement, there's often been this thought like that's the poverty line, but really the poverty line is higher than that. Like you can be poor and still owe taxes in the United States. So I always like to make that point, at least if I'm talking to a Catholic worker group that's thinking, because there are so many different versions of simple living, but even by the federal government's own numbers, like the poverty, like what they consider the poverty line for certain numbers of families, you could be below that poverty line and still owe taxes. So it really is, I'd say, for many people, a more extreme form of simple living to be underneath the taxable limit, so to speak.
Are you all afraid that the IRS is going to show up at your door and say they're taking your house or anything like that because you didn't pay your income taxes?
The quick answer, probably no. I think, bringing up though that fear of the IRS is really a big one that address or try to work with, because the IRS does have kind of a larger than life role in many of our minds here in the U.S. It's just a product of our culture and what we come out of, and so a lot of doing outreach or connecting with people is really how do you alleviate that fear that the IRS is going to come and take our money, our house, and different things. And mostly a lot of that is sharing in recent history that has not been the case, that the IRS garnishing wages or taking people's houses. But, that fear is very much alive in people's minds. And so mostly like sharing that information with people, but also letting them know that there are consequences, that the laws do change over time, and that they're to make sure that people are fully aware of the risks that they are taking.
Yeah, so something like a wage levy, a wage garnishment, or a bank levy, like those things do happen from time to time, but the IRS resources are so drained. Even before Trump, they were underfunded, and then when Trump came in, he fired 30% of the IRS workforce. So they're just so far behind with just trying to make the IRS run and process tax returns and maybe do some audits and some of the regular stuff that they want to take care of. So it is a minority of folks who face that. They used to be a bit more aggressive with maybe taking a car and in some rare instances taking homes, but there seemed to be a change in philosophy to move away from that type of action, and we haven't known anyone who's had that happen to them since the mid-90s. Though there was a long-term war tax resister who has a much more Gandhian viewpoint of nonviolence, where she's a medical doctor who recently retired, and in the 80s she did have a car taken, and then shortly before she retired a few years ago, the IRS contacted her. I think it's maybe more of a scare tactic to say, could we meet with you at your home and just have a conversation? And she said, sure, come over, where I think most people would be like very afraid. And, but she invited them both over and they had a good conversation. And according to her, they had a good conversation. And at one point she said, oh, and I should mention, when she was working when this happened, she was the type of doctor who she lived in Madison, Wisconsin, but she would travel around into the very rural areas. She'd be like that doctor that showed up at the clinic, maybe a couple days a month. So, for her car was needed for work. And she brought up that her car in the 80s had been taken by the IRS and auctioned off. And would they ever consider doing that again? And then they kind of looked at each other for a moment, then said, but if we took your car, how would you work? And, she thought, she said, that wasn't a concern of your coworkers in the 80s. But I just think it shows how things change from decade to decade.
Yeah, and I think that also, makes me think of, too, the resistors that our current war tax resistant movement comes out of, and that would be, or at least tracing it back towards the world wars and World War II in particular. And so seeing people who were objecting to the war, who were drafted or conscripted and resisting the war, and then after the war's ending, realizing that the preparations for war and paying for the previous wars was still going on. And so a lot of these people faced a lot of hardship in terms of these hard labor camps. And then out of that, like building community within those camps and creating community that went on beyond that time together, that they continued their resistance and supporting each other and being there. And so seeing how that support just continues on and has been part of this movement and resisting, especially with the atomic bomb in World War II, and that really creating a galvanizing effect of resistors.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about Nutric itself? Chrissy mentioned all the classes and ways of learning you have, but what other resources do you offer, or like what does the community of people involved look like?
Yeah, so I can start, and I always, when I first, it was kind of by a happy accident that I came to the Worker in '98, and it was a year later in November of 1999 that the Catholic Worker was one of the main hosts of, so the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, NUTRIC, will have 2 meetings a year, one in November and one in May. And the November '99 meeting happened to be in Milwaukee, so I got to meet all these people. And, after having kind of had the Catholic Worker resistance experience, I was like, oh, these are like normal people. So I always considered these people like, even though right now kind of the two, paid workers for NUTRIC happen to be Catholic workers, generally speaking, most of the people who participate in NUTRIC are not Catholic workers, and they're people that have regular jobs and are, many of them have families, and they might be making mortgage payments, or some are living simply, but, maybe without community. And, so in one sense, I felt like these are people who have especially as I was like maybe 21 years old at the time and living in community, I felt like these people are kind of taking a chance and have a bit more to lose, at least financially, and, thinking about their kids. And, so a lot of the resources, I'll say all of the resources that NUTRIC creates are on our website and available for free. And so it's a very large website. And I'd say if anyone's thinking about war tax resistance, definitely like go to our website and wade in the water. It's because it at first it can kind of be intimidating. On the main website is where there's just one video on the main website, and it's an intro video that kind of goes through the basics. I'd recommend people watch that video because they might realize they had questions that they didn't even know they had, and then just check out all these different resources that are there. And throughout the website there might be more videos or little booklets or people sharing their own stories. But the main kind of focus or purpose of all of this is on the website is that if someone's thinking about it, we want them to know kind of what the law is, what laws they might be breaking, but also then what's the likelihood of anything happening and what's most likely to happen, similar to like jaywalking. Some places jaywalking's illegal, some places it's not, some places they enforce it depending on who you are, and other places they may never. And, so we try to go through all those different situations and offer it, what can be most, and offer for all these different situations what we think can be helpful. And we are on social media like, Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and there we'll kind of put things that we think might be helpful or alert people to our existence. But at the end of the day, we'd want people to eventually make their way over to our website so that they can, because it can be, since it's based on, tax resistance is based on taxes, which can be very complex depending on your situation. The upside of that is there's a lot of adaptability. It's not just a one size fits all. So if someone, feels comfortable or is willing to go out of their comfort zone perhaps and, figure out if they wade in these resources, I think that there's a good chance they'll find a method of doing it that they feel comfortable with and feels right for them.
I think too, Nutric provides, that community of support. I think we see a lot of people who look at the situation and knowing what their taxes are going towards, and decide to resist paying their taxes for war, and then sometimes getting letters from the IRS, and then they find out about Nutric and reach out. And so I think a lot of people that sometimes that fear of the IRS or different things, that it can be isolating, and so creating that community of support and information clearinghouse has been a large role of Nutric over the decades.
And maybe I'll just add, we host their Nutric often becomes a hub where, if there are local groups, we have a part on our website with local contacts, area groups, and it's not like they're mini Nutrics. Nutric I think one reason I was also attracted to the organization is similar to the Catholic worker movement, or at least the way most Catholic workers operate. It works by consensus. And the national organization started because there were all these local groups that realized they were duplicating resources. And so it's really the national groups there to help with discussion among all of the local groups and individuals. So it's not meant to be a top-down organization. And one of the groups who we host on our website is called the War Tax Resistance Penalty Fund. And they're a mutual aid group. And they essentially, now when it's more rare, but when I first became a war tax resistor, it was much more common that people might have their wages garnished, and they would send out these appeals usually 4 times a year. Now it might be once a year, and they'll say, hey, this person got collected upon, and they want to pass the hat not to reimburse for the initial principal that they would owe, but at least to help when you get collected upon. It might be later on, and there's additional penalties and interest, and that's kind of the extra part that can really hurt. And they'll pass the hat to try and reimburse for interest and penalties. And usually, if everyone pitches in around $25 to $30, they're able to do that. So I know this past year there was one person who had a bank account collected upon, and they were able to raise all the funds for that. And when I spoke at the Catholic Worker in Madison, there was someone who had been collected upon like 20 years ago. And I think they said their interest and penalties that they owed was around $8,000. And they actually had the whole amount reimbursed just by everyone passing the hat, because there's everyone kind of throwing in a little bit because they knew one of their, someone that it could have been them, someone else was collected upon, and they wanted to make sure the situation wasn't as difficult.
And I think, Chrissy had mentioned it doesn't always have to be sort of like this all or nothing thing for people who maybe have the fear of being collected upon, and that there are ways to sort of enter this in just testing it out, of withholding smaller amounts or strategizing to minimize taxes that are paid. You talk a little bit about that, of what maybe if jumping in and not paying income taxes feels like too big of a jump for some people, or living below that federal limit seems undoable for people. What are some of the other ways that people can start to explore some of this?
Yeah, I think, that's a great point in terms of, we know that people's life circumstances change over time. And so, some people begin by withholding maybe $10 in the first year, or sometimes people look at what percentage of taxes goes towards the Pentagon, and will withhold, say, 50% for this coming year.
To follow up on what Chrissy was saying, there, some folks who might say, look on the internet and try to find like this. And this was something that I definitely got questions about. I truthfully don't know the specific percentage or answer, but there are people who called and said, because I looked up and it looks like this percentage of the budget is being used for ICE, like that's the amount I'm going to resist. And obviously ICE is just one part of the military industrial complex. It's a much smaller component and, smaller amount, though. As Chrissy said, there might be other folks who just to try to test the waters and see how they feel about getting all these letters. Because whether, if you file and you refuse to pay anything from like $1 to $1 million, you're still going to get basically all the same automated letters, and they'll all be just as scary. So there was someone I talked to yesterday where I think they owed $15,000. They had just found our website. Taxes are due very soon, and they're, and the couple had both called on the phone together, and I couldn't tell. It seemed like I could tell which one was maybe more interested, and maybe one was a bit more fearful. And through having a conversation with them, especially with time being of the essence, it seemed like they were going to maybe just resist $500 this year, because they knew at that level, other than getting letters, nothing is really going to happen. But I will say there have been different waves, as came up earlier, when shortly after the invasion of Gaza, it really seemed like it was mostly younger folks in their 20s and 30s that had the most interest. But when Trump first came in his second time, and there was Doge, the Department of something efficiency, I don't remember. But with Elon Musk and all that, and they're cutting all these programs, governmental efficiency. So anyway, Doge is cutting all these programs, and there, all of a sudden, there was a huge additional wave of interest from people who are definitely like older and much higher incomes. And probably the few months of when Doge was really in high gear, I talked to a lot of people who owed taxes of like $60,000. And I'm just like, I can't even imagine how much money you make in a year. And so one of the things that this doesn't come up as much with Catholic workers, but one of the things that could be a potential, which will happen if you owe a certain amount, it goes up with inflation, but for 2025, if you owed $64,000, which the IRS considers a seriously delinquent tax debt, then you'll lose the ability to renew your passport. It's unclear if this is actually legal, but so far there hasn't been a good court case against it. So it's a newer law, and it's definitely, some people want to have the option to leave the country. So I will say, with people who do owe more in taxes, many of them, after having a conversation about it, decided, well, I'm just going to, for them, the more token amount was, I'm going to resist $3,000 this year, because they knew that, also there's a 10-year statute of limitations once you file your taxes. So after 10 years, all the principal, interest, and penalties from that 10 years ago disappears. So if you were going to resist $3,000 a year and continued it every year, you would never reach that amount of money. So with many higher income earners, for them, the token amount would be kind of a larger amount for me, but it was for them. So again, I guess showing that adaptability for different people, a smaller amount to test the waters can mean very different things.
And I think it's quite exciting, because seeing a lot of people take on tax resistance as one approach of many in this time to resist policies of the government. And so seeing these higher wage earners resisting, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And so a lot of people too, like lawyers, being very public in their resistance and really, having a cascading effect and encouraging others and getting that word out there. So I think we are at a really unique moment with tax resistance in the United States, with more people embracing that as one of many forms of resistance.
Well, is there anything else we should know about war tax resistance, or the Catholic worker in war tax resistance, or anything else?
Sure. I did think, I just thought of something that I probably should have mentioned earlier, just at least Catholic worker related, where I think at the time this just seemed very normal. When I first joined the Catholic worker in Milwaukee in '98, I just figured a lot of Catholic workers do this, but I don't think that's really the case, or at least hasn't been the case, where we had, for us, our biggest protest, like we had a number of protests planned during the year for protest the military presence on Marquette University as a Catholic campus, and we'd go to different gun shops and, participate against the naval base up north with extremely low frequency, as they called it, the ELF base. But our biggest protest of the year that everyone got real excited about was tax day, and we'd go in front of the IRS office. And then a number of us, which I just started doing. So actually the vast majority of my arrests as a Catholic worker have been at the IRS office, because that was just like what you did every year. And so we would protest outside the IRS office for about an hour. And then most people, the other groups who would join us, most of them would stay out front. And then a few of us Catholic workers would go in because we wanted to share this news with the IRS. And at that point, usually the city of Milwaukee police would arrest us. And so most of it is, and that's where I also learned. So I will say my war tax resistance really brought me on the road of how arrests work, civil disobedience, at least the municipal court system, and how things can really change, or how it matters. It definitely matters who the judge is, because normally we got ticketed with disorderly conduct, and then we'd go up to court, and one year it would be the judge would say, case dismissed. This clear. You're just holding signs and maybe singing. That's not disorderly conduct. And then next year, the judge would be like, "You were singing? That's disorderly conduct. No doubt about it." And and so I remember, one year I usually refused to pay the fine, and sometimes the judge, one year the judge sent us to prison for our local jail for 3 days, and one year the judge was like, "I'll just let it go. I don't want to send you guys to jail. There's enough people over there." So it really was kind of by happenstance of how the Casa Maria Catholic Worker worked in Milwaukee with this emphasis on war tax resistance, opened up a lot of different ways of being a Catholic worker also, and other parts of the Catholic worker movement that a lot of people are familiar with arrest, but depending on where you are, perhaps there's a lot of protests outside some missile silos, or maybe it shows how your location as a Catholic worker and who makes up your Catholic worker can really influence how you might find out about arrests and civil disobedience and nonviolence, etc.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, Lincoln. I feel like a lot of the conversation thus far has been, on the historical and national level of war tax resistance, but, how important it is at the local level. And that's really what helped me really be firmly and grow roots into my own war tax resistance, was at the local community. And there in Columbia, Missouri, a lot of the hospitality that we did was with largely Vietnam vets, a lot of veterans. And so seeing the consequences of the war. And, that was quite some years later after these men had returned from their service, and just seeing the impact of war on an individual level and how poignant that was in the consequences of war, and having that ever present. And really, so having that rootedness in hospitality and being there to be a presence for the shell shock, if you will, of war, and to also resist, to have that as motivation for resistance towards militarism, and to really kind of reclaim the imagination of where do we put our resources, not just our money, but our life, and what it is we're trying to invest in and build in. And so, I think to celebrate that as the resource, and to come together in community in doing that, but that it was, the impact on a local level that really impacted and rooted that resistance in a major way. And I think all of us can look within our communities to find the imprint of war and weapons manufacturing, and to really take claim to that, and invest in, commit to resisting that. Here in St. Louis, we have Boeing, where they've been making smart bombs for a long time, and also, the impact of witnessing war and trying to bring that awareness to other people, but really to commit on a local level to the weapons manufacturers, as well as investing in the building blocks of life and investing in creating that and spreading that.
Well, thank you both for being willing to come on and share more about this. It's been exciting to see it gain more of this traction in the last couple of years, and just to see it on people's awareness that we can push back against war. It doesn't have to be the default for American culture.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here again.
Yeah, great to be here and sharing with you all and the wider audience.
Well, thanks to Lincoln and Chrissy for joining us. It's a really interesting topic to talk about. I personally had never heard of war tax resistance until joining the Catholic Worker. It just was not something that had ever crossed my radar.
Yeah, I had not ever heard of war tax resistance either. I feel like it has, for many people, not paying your taxes has kind of a conservative bent to it. When most people hear that someone's not paying taxes, they think, oh, they must be like one of these Republicans who don't believe in helping people or something like that. But it's amazing to sit down and think about just how little of it actually goes to helping people instead of lining the pockets of weapons manufacturers and stuff like that. And, I guess it's dating the episode slightly, but we just heard from the White House they want to add like an additional $700 billion or something like that to the Pentagon's budget, which is pretty wild.
Yeah. I think there's sometimes it's a interesting piece of tension where I do hear those super conservative voices sort of being like, pushing back against taxes, saying, well, I don't use those services, I don't need them. And then sometimes a more progressive group of people talking about almost like taxes as like a common good to help pay for different services. But yeah, when you really look at it, a lot of the money is not going towards any sort of common good, but rather going towards things like war and violence, and pieces of oppression.
Yeah. And right now we're in the midst of this assault on Iran, and just the crazy amount that they've spent in just like a few days and a few weeks on that, this conflict that's extremely unpopular and seemingly not good for everyday people's pocketbooks. And, we're paying for it to the tune of tens and hundreds of billions just for that. And we're paying for Israel's weapons too, is a big thing. We just talked to our friends who visited Palestine, and our tax dollars aren't just paying for U.S. war, they're paying for Israel's war too.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciate is like sometimes all of these issues, they feel so big and like there's no way to sort of push back against them. And one of the things I appreciate about Catholic Workers is that people do find ways to have elements of resistance. And, maybe it doesn't necessarily immediately change the world, but I think that's important as like a moral ethic to not become complacent in things. And maybe it's war tax resistance, maybe it's peace delegations to Palestine, maybe it's other things of participating in boycotts or helping push clarification of thought. But I think it's such a good reminder that everybody can do something to not be complicit in sort of the war machine that we create.
Yeah. It was interesting to hear Lincoln talking about, when he was newer at Casa Maria, that they're kind of biggest thing every year was tax day, and just that every, communities have different emphasis. And I mean, war tax resistance is widespread, but I don't think I've ever been in a community where like war tax or tax day was the big protest day of the year necessarily, but that was Lincoln's experience of Casa Maria when he showed up.
Yeah. I don't know that I have heard of any communities immediately surrounding here who have done that.
Yeah. I think it used to be even more common. You used to have to go take your taxes to the post office. And so tax day was the busiest day of the year at the post office. So I think it used to be more common. People would go hold their signs or pass out literature as people were waiting in line to drop off their tax returns each year. But now it's all digital.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's even the nature of that makes it feel like 1 degree farther separated too, in a certain way. You don't have to like sit down and calculate it all out. It's kind of just numbers spit out of a computer that go out into the ether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think I've only ever known one person ever who has actually gone and like mailed in a physical tax return. So it might be slightly different to sort of protest taxes at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I appreciate about the Catholic worker too, and just like the communal living aspect of it, is kind of empowering people to take actions like this too. If you're trying to live below that taxable income, it helps to like do it in community where you're sharing the cost of rent or just life or whatnot. Or if you're doing it in a serious, more risky way, just having that support behind you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. In all of this, if it was interesting to hear Lincoln talking about, Catholic workers who do it in some ways, there is less risk for them than everyday people who are also doing this war tax resistance. And that's a little ironic, of I think Catholic workers are sometimes used to being viewed as like the radical ones who are risking so much. And there's also people who have a lot to risk and are like, yeah, we're gonna do this.
Yeah. Chrissy was telling me that they were recently featured in an article in the Guardian of London, that they did get a little hate mail in response to their being interviewed in there, and somebody was threatening them. I'm going to go tell the IRS. I know your names. It was in the article. And Chrissy and Lincoln are just like, yeah, I don't know. Like, we've been public about this for a long time. We're not too terribly worried about you going and telling the IRS once, that you read about us in an international publication recently.
Yeah, when people are going in like teaching workshops on it, the cat's kind of already out of the bag on that one. Well, if people are interested more in about war tax resistance, can go in person to the November gathering in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Catholic Worker. More info will be posted eventually on Nutric's website. So, or people can always go to the site and look for more resources there to look at dipping the foot in war tax resistance, or maybe withholding all of the taxes next year, I suppose. Well, that wraps up for us another episode of Coffee with Catholic Workers. We want to thank our Catholic worker audio engineer, Chris, as well as David Hayes for our music, Becky McIntyre for our graphics.
Thanks for joining us again for some clarification of thought. We hope today's conversation has been enlightening, and maybe even that you're encouraged to go out and help build a world where it's easier to be good.